It started with something so small and unimportant that I still can't believe it led to everything falling apart. I was folding clothes in the living room when Jack yelled from the hallway, "Emmy, can you help me with this?" I turned to find him standing at the steps, struggling with his belt buckle. He wore khaki shorts that hung loosely on his hips, and the leather strap of his belt twisted uncomfortably. "Can you repair it?" he remarked. "It's stuck or something," as he approached me with the belt. I said, laying the folded towels aside. I came closer, grasping for the belt and attempting to disentangle the strap from the clasp. "Older still," I answered, focusing. "Yeah. Sorry," he said, holding his breath as I worked. But as I yanked on the leather, the buckle gave way, and, before one of us could react, his shorts slid down to his ankles. The world seemed to freeze. My gaze darted downward for a brief moment. An uncontrollable impulse surged through me, capturing everything before I swiftly averted my gaze. Jack stood still, his hands hovering uncomfortably and his face going crimson. Sorry," he murmured, before immediately tugging his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks flaring as I stuttered. "That's okay, this occurs." "Yes," he said, his voice strained. "Thank you for your help." He turned and dashed upstairs, leaving me standing there, my pulse beating and my mind reeling. It was only an accident, a brief moment of embarrassment, but the electric energy in the room and the way his gaze lingered on mine as he walked away altered something. We never discussed it, but our relationship was never the same after that. My marriage to Alan was not a typical love story. It wasn't awful either, just a peaceful, cozy setup that had lost its warmth over the years we were married. When I was 44, he was 51. We were both coming off unsuccessful first marriages. Alan was a man with habits and hobbies. He played golf on Saturdays, went fishing once a month, and had an unending cycle of client dinner that kept him out late most of the time. I'd learned to accept our silences as part of the arrangement, filling my days with charity work, gardening, housework. But then Jack moved in. Alan's kid from his previous marriage had always been courteous but aloof from me. I had only seen him a few times in the early years of my marriage, on compulsory holiday visits when he was still in college. He was really reserved back then. It's awkward when young guys are forced to share rooms with their new stepmothers. And 6 years later, the guy who arrived at our door was not the bashful adolescent I recall. Jack had just graduated and was striving to find his place in the world. His degrees in fine arts, something Alan still rolled his eyes over, had not resulted in quick success, so Alan offered him a place to stay until he straightened things out. I was not consulted about the situation, yet I did not disagree. The home was large enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind having some company during Alan's long days at work or with friends. What I didn't expect was how quickly Jack's presence changed the vibe in the home. He seemed uncomfortable. He possessed a natural charisma that drew people in. His sense of comedy was dry, yet disarming. His smile was contagious, and his presence filled the empty rooms of the home in a way that Alan's never did. It began with simple moments. One morning, I was trimming the bushes in the backyard when Jack came out with a cup of coffee. Barefoot and unkempt from sleep, he leaned against the patio door, grinning lazily as he watched me work. "You're awake early," I commented, staring at him. He shrugged and sipped his coffee. "Couldn't sleep? Besides, someone has to admire all the effort you're putting in out here." I chuckled quietly and shook my head. "Do not let Alan hear you say that he believes this garden takes care of itself," Jack said, casually yet pointedly. Alan doesn't notice much, although the remark surprised me. I chose not to question him about it. Instead, I continued pruning, painfully aware of his eyes fixed on me. Our chats expanded in length throughout the weeks, and our interactions established a consistent rhythm in the home. Jack would hang out in the kitchen as I cooked, telling me anecdotes about his college days or asking for guidance on job applications. One day, I discovered him stretched on the living room couch, doodling in a notebook. "Do you mind if I have a look?" I questioned, nodding to the pad. He paused for a bit before handing it up. The pages were covered with exquisite pencil doodles, portraits, landscapes, and abstract patterns were alive with movement. "These are amazing," I said honestly. "Thank you," he murmured quietly. "It's simply something I do to pass the time. You should show these to someone," I said. "A gallery or an artistic director, Jack. You have genuine skill." He gave a small smile as his eyes met mine. "You're the first one to say that." The weight of his words sat between us, and I felt the pain of something I couldn't pinpoint. Then the belt incident occurred, and everything changed for several days thereafter. The air between us seemed electrified, heavy with an underlying tension that none of us understood how to deal with. I tried to avoid being alone with him as much as possible, but it was fruitless. The home was too quiet, and there were too many opportunities for us to cross paths. Jack entered the kitchen one evening while I was doing dishes, his hair moist after a shower. He spoke softly to Emmy. I turned, my pulse beating at the way he pronounced my name. "Yes." He hesitated, his hands tucked into the pockets of his pants. I apologized for the embarrassing situation from the other day. "It's all right," I said hastily, returning to the wash basin. "Let's forget about that. I'm not sure I can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the gravity of his words setting in. I slowly turned to face him, my chest tense with conflicting feelings. "Jack, we can't," I began. I wasn't sure how to continue the phrase. He moved closer, his stare unwavering. "I know, but I don't want you to believe it meant nothing to me." His voice was so intense that I couldn't speak, and neither of us moved for a while. Alan's voice rang out from the front door, breaking the enchantment. "I'll be right there," I said hurriedly, moving away from Jack. But even as I walked away, I knew something had changed between us, something that could not be reversed. First, the days that followed were a jumble of avoidance and brief looks. Despite his ignorance, Alan spent his nights watching television or hanging out with friends, leaving Jack and me to navigate the complex situation we had created. One afternoon, while I folded laundry in the guest room, Jack arrived at the doorway. "Can we speak?" he inquired, his voice uncertain. I paused before nodding. "Close the door." He walked inside, slammed the door behind him. "I'm not sure how to act around you anymore," he said, his voice rough. "Jack, we need to let this go." I spoke, my voice trembling. "It was just a second, but it wasn't just for a minute," he explained, getting closer. "At least not for me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time I allowed myself to accept the reality. It was more than simply a moment for me. There's a point when we realized you're about to cross a queue and there's no turning back. I knew it the first time Jack kissed me. Nothing about this was ever intended. It happened late one evening after Alan had attended one of his golf mates' poker sessions. I was in the kitchen, cleaning off the countertops, when Jack entered. "Can't sleep?" I inquired, staring at him. "Something like that," he murmured, leaning against the door, his bare feet. His hair was untidy, and his stance caught my chest to tighten. We stood there in quiet for a minute, the only sound being the gentle hum of the refrigerator. When I finally looked up, the The intensity of his gaze left me speechless. "Emmy," he added quietly, stepping forward. "Jack, don't," I muttered, even as my heart raced. "I can't stop thinking about you." He spoke softly, pettily. "You have to," I said, my voice quavering. "This is incorrect. You are aware of this." "I know," he murmured, narrowing the gap between us. "But that does not affect my feelings." Then he kissed me. It was tentative at first. It felt as if he was waiting for me to shove him away, but I did not. I could not. When I finally moved back, my heart was beating and I couldn't meet his gaze. "This cannot happen again," I murmured, barely audible. He nodded, but the expression in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a blur of snatched moments and silent anguish. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was too strong to ignore. Every glance and unintentional touch felt electrifying, bearing the weight of our unsaid words. Alan remained blissfully ignorant. His focus divided between his job, friends, and his numerous interests. Despite his preoccupation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were risking our lives the second time. It occurred in the garden. I had been trimming the roses all morning, the warm sun beating down on my back, when Jack arrived behind me. "You're always out here," he murmured, breaking the silence. "It's calm," I said without glancing around. He took a step closer, casting his shadow over me. "I guess you'd like avoiding me." My breath caught. I pushed myself to remain cool. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, don't you?" he inquired, his voice quiet yet urgent. I turned to face him and my chest tightened as I caught his eyes. There was no hesitancy this time, no way to argue myself out of it. He kissed me again, and I kissed him back. What started as ephemeral moments gradually turned into something neither of us could stop. We were cautious at first, seeking peaceful areas of the home where we would not be disturbed, but the more time we spent together, the more confident we got. While Alan was at a client dinner, Jack and I ended up at the library. I was pretending to tidy the shelves, my hands quivering as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he said softly, his breath warm on my neck. "I'm okay," I responded, but my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders and turned me to face him. "You don't need to be terrified," he replied quietly. "I am not frightened of you," I whispered. "I'm terrified of what we're doing." He cradled my face in his palms and maintained a steady look. "Then don't think about it. Just be with me." I wanted to fight and tell him that we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I allowed him to take me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt energized. The secret of our relationship only heightened its intensity. Every snatched minute seemed like a protest against the life I'd settled for, a reminder that passion still existed and yearning hidden behind the humdrum of my marriage. But with the joy comes fear. One afternoon, as Jack and I sat on the living room couch, Alan arrived home earlier than planned. "Emmy," he yelled out from the hallway. I leapt up, my pulse beating, as Jack dashed to the other side of the room. "Enter here," I called, back attempting to maintain a steady voice. Alan strolled in and glanced between us. "I had no idea you'd have company," he replied, his tone nonchalant, but his gaze lingered on Jack. Jack answered, just catching up his stance, relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent chills down my spine. As careful as we were, it grew more difficult to disguise. Alan started asking questions, initially subtle, but gradually becoming sharper. Jack appeared to be getting along well, he said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. Hyun's been a tremendous help around the house, I said, feigning a grin. Alan nodded. His look is unreadable. I'm pleased to see that it's comforting to know someone is keeping you company while I'm working. His words were tinged with something I couldn't identify, and I felt blood drain from my cheeks. The first serious breach appeared when Jack's best buddy, Grant, stepped up unexpectedly. Grant was outspoken, opinionated, and had a talent for picking up on what others tried to conceal. You've spent a lot of time at home, Grant said to Jack one afternoon, his tone light but his eyes piercing. Jack said nonchalantly, "Just helping out. Must be good." Grant remarked, his gaze shifting to me. "Having somebody to keep you company?" The statement sent a shudder down my spine. I hurriedly excused myself, leaving the two of them alone. Later, Jack discovered me in the kitchen, his look stern. Grant spoke quietly. "He's guessing," I responded. My voice wavering, Jack shakes his head. "He is not foolish, Emmy. He is going to figure things out as the weeks passed." Even if my voice trembled, tension inside the home became overwhelming. In Grant's comments and the significance of our secret, the atmosphere was akin to an impending storm. However, as the hazards increased, so did my feelings for Jack. And no matter how serious the situation grew, I couldn't bring myself to let him leave. Maintaining a secret is like trying to breathe underwater. You can only do it for so long before the strain begins to overwhelm you. Jack, and bullish at concealing, but the flaws in our facade were widening. Neither Grant was foolish then. There was Heather Allen's colleague, whose casual visits became increasingly invasive with each passing week. Heather arrived on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced, yet entirely at ease. She had gone to the house several times previously, usually under the guise of dropping off something for Alan. This time she arrived with a bottle of wine and an overly bright grin. She stepped into the kitchen where I was cutting vegetables and said, "I thought I'd stop by. Alan said that you have been feeling a bit overloaded recently. I thought you could use a diversion." "I'm all right," I said with a forced smile. "I didn't," I said to her, "and I'm glad you didn't smile, but thank you, Heather." Set the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her gaze searching the room as if she were memorizing each feature. "This site is stunning. You've done an excellent job making it seem like a home." "Thank you," I spoke firmly. Her eyes remained on the rear door where Jack had exited just minutes before. "Alan is fortunate to have you. And Jack. Of course. He's a tremendous help around here, isn't he?" Of course my heart raced, but my demeanor remained neutral. "He's been excellent. It's beneficial to have him around." Heather's lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. I believe it is Heather's presence got increasingly common over time. She made reasons to drop by, usually under the pretense of work. But her true intention was evident. She was looking for something herself. I couldn't tell whether it was information or Alan himself. She mentioned one afternoon, as we sat in the living room, that Alan doesn't discuss much about his personal life. But I get the impression that things have not been excellent between you two. I tensed and gripped the teacup in my lap. Every marriage faces problems. "Oh, sure," Heather said, her tone tinged with faux compassion, "but having Jack around really helps." He seemed attentive. The connotation of her words was clear, and I felt a rush of terror rise in my chest. Then there was Grant, Jack's closest buddy, had always been frank and nasty, but his comments suddenly had a harsher edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Emmy," Grant said to Jack one evening as they sat on the terrace, beers in hand, Jack shrugged, maintaining a casual tone. She's my stepmother, of course. We are going to chat. Yeah, but it's not only that, right? Grant pressed. With a keen look, Jack's grasp on the bottle tightened. What exactly are you trying to say? Grant said. I'm saying you're acting weird, and I do not believe it is only due to my employment. There's something more going on, and I believe it concerns her. Jack stood suddenly, knocking his chair against the stone. You're not sure what you're talking about? Grant's eyes narrowed. Don't I? The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like navigating a precarious situation. Every visit from Heather felt like an inevitable challenge, and Jack's assertiveness was increasing as his dissatisfaction with our secret surfaced one evening as we sat in the library. He turned to me, his countenance steely. I can't keep doing this, he explained. Jack, we must be careful, I said, my voice cracking. Careful isn't enough. Heather is suspicious. Heather is sniffing about. Ellen is not as naive as you believe. I averted my gaze, tears welling up in the corners of my eyes. What are your suggestions? That we stop? He approached, his voice softening. You know, I can't do it, but we have to figure out what we're going to do because this isn't sustainable. The breaking point occurred during a dinner party that Alan insisted on throwing. Heather was present, of course, as were a few of Alan's co-workers. Jack had invited Grant, who turned up as well. The evening began off innocently enough. Polite conversation, laughs, and the clinking of wine glasses. But as the night progressed, the atmosphere transformed. So Emmy, Heather said, her voice cutting through the area. How do you keep yourself occupied with Alan away? So often I froze her inquiry, rife with insinuation. The usual things I said, keeping my tone light, gardening, reading, and assisting Jack with various tasks. Heather's grin tightened. You must be really close now. Across the table, Grant lifted an eyebrow, his eyes shifting to Jack. Yeah, Jack has been spending a lot of time here recently. I suppose it makes sense. Emmy is fairly simple to chat with. The table went hushed, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Alan gazed between us, his expression enigmatic, while Heather sipped her wine, her eyes gleaming with pleasure. Jack pushed his chair back forcefully. Excuse me, he mumbled before exiting the room. I think I'll check on him. I responded immediately, rising up before nobody could stop me. I discovered Jack in the yard, pacing in the gentle light of the patio lights as I approached. He replied, This is a mistake. What was it? I inquired, my heart thumping all of it. He said, his voice thick with fury. Allowing Grant to come here, pretending everything is okay. Emmy, it isn't. Fine. It has gone apart. I reached for him, my fingers brushing across his arm. We will work it out. He looked at me, his eyes full of despair. How? Because I'm running out of methods to hold this together. Before I could react, the sound of footfall on the gravel caused us both to pause. I turned around to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face hidden but his posture tight. What is going on out here? He inquired, his voice low and threatening. Alan stood at the edge of the lawn, his body hard against the gentle glow of the patio lights. Jack was tight beside me, and there was silence for a few periods. The stillness was deafening, and my mind raced for anything to say, anything to break the tension that lingered in the air. Alan, I began, attempting a grin. We were just talking, he interrupted, his tone stern. He stepped nearer, his gaze shifting between me and Jack. It's amusing how you two seem to have so much to speak about these days. Jack straightened his jaw, clenching. Is there an issue? Alan twisted his lips into a chilly grin. I'm not sure, Jack. Should there be? The weight of his words hit me like a blow in the belly. I felt my breath seize. This was no longer simply suspicion. He knew, I believe. I'll go inside. Jack remarked. His voice was firm yet strained. No, Alan snapped, leaving no space for dispute. You will stay right here. Jack paused but did not move. Alan focused his attention on me, his eyes black. Can you explain why my wife and kid are sneaking about in the yard during a dinner party? I opened my lips, but the words did not come. The tension rose during the next day. Alan was colder than ever, with cut teeth. His tone, frigid gaze made it apparent that he was not going to let this go. Heather attempted to keep his distance, but that just made matters worse. Heather, of course, found a way to integrate herself into the turmoil. I couldn't help but notice the uneasiness last night, she admitted as she sipped her coffee in the kitchen. It was merely a misunderstanding, I explained, trying to keep my tone light. Heather inclined her head, her grin too lovely to be real. Of course, but Amy, you might want to be cautious. Perceptions may be deadly. Particularly in this scenario. Her remarks were a disguised menace, and I knew she relished every moment of it. The true twist came later in the evening. Alan beckoned me into the study, his manner serene yet unsettling. I've been thinking, he remarked, leaning back in his chair. Maybe it's time to make some modifications. Changes? I asked cautiously. Jack has been here long enough. Alan continued, his tone nonchalant. I believe it's time he moved on. He found his own space. My heart fell. Alan is still finding things out, and he can figure things out someplace else, Alan said sharply. Emmy, this is not up for dispute. When I informed Jack, he reacted explosively. Is he kicking me out? Jack spoke, his voice rising because of what a chat in the guard. What, he's suspicious, Jack? I murmured, trying to remain cool. He thinks. What Jack snaps is something happening. This is his problem, not ours. I put my hand on his arm, attempting to support him. We knew this was a possibility, and we can't allow it to become worse. Jack shook his head as his jaw tightened. He's not doing this because he is suspicious. He's doing this to dominate you, and I'm not going to allow him the night. Alan urged Jack to go was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your belongings. Alan stated over dinner, his tone calm but forceful. Jack's fork clattered on his plate as he rose quickly. You do not get to determine when I depart. This is my house, Alan said, his voice chilly. I will not put up with this anymore. What exactly are you tolerating? Jack shot back, his voice raised. I am here, or I am getting closer to Emmy than you ever could. The room went quiet, and I felt blood draining from my face. Alan's face clouded as he stood. His words low, menacing, yet out of the house before I make you regret it. That night I discovered Jack in his room. His baggage was half packed. You cannot let him win, he murmured, his voice taut with rage. This isn't about winning, I explained, my voice quivering. This is about survival. He turned to face me, his eyes burning. You do not have to stay here. You do not have to stay with him. I have no option, I said. Tears flowing down my cheeks. Jack stepped closer and said, There's always a choice. Come with me. His words remained in the air, and for a time, I allowed myself to envision them leaving everything behind and beginning again somewhere far away. But the reality of what it meant hit me hard, and I shook my head. I cannot, I spoke, my voice cracking. Jack gazed at me for a long time before nodding. Then I'll leave, he replied gently, but it's not over. Jack had left the next morning. Alan did not talk to me, so I spent the day roaming around the empty home, scared by the stillness. But the big shock arrived that evening. I discovered a message pushed under my bedroom door. You believe you won, Alan, but you don't know the reality. I'll make sure you do. Heather, my hands trembled as I read the message. The consequences. setting in. Heather knew she had seen or overheard something that she was now employing to her advantage. Heather's message, Mage, weighed heavily on my mind. I stood stuck in my bedroom, reading the words repeatedly until they blurred together. My initial inclination was to approach her and demand to know what she felt she had on me. But the fact was that I already knew she'd seen or heard enough to piece together something deadly, and she now wielded absolute authority. The encounter happened 2 days later. Heather invited her S back again, this time pretending to deliver some documents for Alan. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and stern, as I held up the message. "What's this?" I demanded, hands shaking. Heather did not even flinch. She leaned against the counter, a little grin on her lips. "This is exactly what it says. Do you believe Alan deserves to know the truth?" "There's nothing to say," I said hastily, though my voice wavered. Heather lifted an eyebrow, her look full of faux compassion. "Emmy, you don't really believe that, do you? I have seen how you and Jack gaze at each other. I am not blind." My chest clenched, and I moved closer, dropping my voice. "If you believe you can use this to influence me, you are mistaken. I refuse to let you destroy my family." Heather giggled quietly and shook her head. "Would you destroy your family, Emmy? You have already done that. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable before I could react." Alan's words echoed down the corridor. Heather's smile grew. She said, "Don't worry, I will manage the time." Alan was quieter than usual that evening, picking at his supper with a tight expression. Heather had departed hours before, yet her presence lingered like a shadow over the home. I didn't know if she'd said anything to him, but the stillness between us was oppressive. Finally, Alan put his fork down and glanced at me. "Emmy, is there anything you'd like to tell me? My heart has ceased to beat." I mustered a grin. "Baking uncertainty." "What do you mean?" Alan sat back in his chair, his gaze narrowed. "You have been acting strangely recently, and then there's Heather, who alludes at things I don't comprehend. If there's anything going on, now is the moment to inform me." Panic sprang in my chest, but I maintained my cool. "Alan, there is nothing going on. Heather is simply trying to create drama. You know how she is." Alan gave me a long look before nodding slowly. "I hope you're correct," he continued, his tone heavy with caution. "For if I find out differently," he didn't finish the statement, but he didn't have to that night. I was unable to sleep. I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, my thoughts racing with possibilities. Heather's threat hovered over me, and Alan's growing mistrust made each action feel like one step closer to tragedy. Then just as I was falling asleep, my phone rang on the nightstand. I snatched it, my pulse racing as I read the message. "Meet me tomorrow around noon in the park by the bridge." Jack, the following day, I left the house under the guise of performing errands. My hands clutched the driving wheel firmly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jack could have to say when I arrived. He was waiting at the bridge. His hands were tucked inside his jacket pocket. "You should not have approached me," I murmured as I neared, my voice shaking. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his eyes black with fury. Heather came to visit me. What I inhaled and the ground underneath me seemed to shift. Jack replied, "She knows, Emmy," in a quiet, concerned tone. "She knows everything, and is using it to get to Alan." My stomach churned. "What exactly did she say to you? She wanted me to confess," he remarked coldly. "To tell Alan the truth, Emmy. She's playing us both." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the situation push down on me. I murmured, "We are running out of time." Jack stretched for my hand, and his contact grounded me. then we need to act before she does.